Assalamu alaikum. My name is Aisha Jamshida. Today I'll be discussing about the suitability and the fairness of penalizing parties who fail to fulfill court orders as contempt of court under the Malaysian law. To give you an overview, I will briefly explain how I have divided this PPT into different sections. First, I have the introduction, where I will introduce the main topic and outline what we will discuss today. Next is the legal framework of contempt of court in Malaysia. In this section, I will discuss what laws and legal provisions gives the court the power to punish contempt. Following that is the justification for penalizing non-compliance. In this section, I will try to examine why the court needs this authority to maintain order and justice. And the next is arguments supporting the suitability and fairness, highlighting reasons why this approach is fair and appropriate. And finally, I will conclude with a summary and final thoughts on the overall discussion of this topic. In a democratic society, the stability and the harmony of community depend heavily on a strong legal system that is rooted in the principles of checks and balances, separation of powers, and the rule of law. Trust in this system to resolve disputes and administer justice is the foundation on which the societal peace is built. A key aspect of maintaining the integrity of the justice system is the concept of contempt of court, which is a broad offense that includes any violation of rules aimed at ensuring the proper functioning of courts. Contempt of court is a power that is granted to the judiciary either by statute or inherent authority that allows courts to hear and punish acts that threaten their authority and administration of justice. So, in this presentation, I'll try to explore the suitability and fairness of penalizing parties who neglect or refuse to fulfill court orders as contempt of court under the Malaysian law. I'll also try to examine the legal frameworks governing the contempt, assess its alignment with the principle of justice and fairness, and consider the balance between protecting judicial authority and safeguarding individual rights. In Malaysia, there is no single comprehensive law specifically dedicated to contempt of court. Instead, the enforcement of court authority is through contempt proceedings, which is based on a combination of statutes, relevant principles of rule of law, and established judicial precedents. However, the higher courts, including the federal court, which is the previous Supreme Court, the High Court, and the subordinate courts are given the power under the Federal Constitution 1957, Courts of Judicature Act 1964, and the Subordinate Courts Act 1948 to punish contempt of court in judicial proceedings. Also, procedural rules such as the Rules of Court 2012 provide a practical guidance for handling contempt of court cases. However, neither the Constitution Act or the Acts of Parliament or any other written law define or spell out how to deal with contempt of court in Malaysia. It is essentially regarded as more to be a common law phenomenon. When we look into the specific provisions of these acts, the Federal Constitution 1957 in its section 126 states that the federal court, the court of appeal, or a high court shall have the power to punish any contempt of itself, while the Courts of Judicature Act 1964, section 13 of this act states that the federal court and the court of appeal and the High Court shall have the power to punish any contempt on itself. It was argued that the Article 126 of the Federal Constitution and Section 13 of the Judicature Act only grants the High Court the power to punish contempt without actually conferring the jurisdiction to hear contempt proceedings. However, this was rejected by Justice Anwar in the case MBF Holdings, who clarified that these provisions also give the court the authority to hear and decide on contempt cases. This authority was also affirmed by then Supreme Court in the case of Arthur Lee Meng. When we look into the Subordinate Courts Act 1984, subordinate courts have limited powers to punish contempt of court. The governing law is contained in paragraph 9 and 26 in the third schedule of the Subordinate Court Act 1948. This grants the courts power to district this grants power to district courts and magistrate courts to impose sanctions for contempt committed within their jurisdictions. Such powers include issuing warrants of arrest, fines, or imprisonment, depending on the circumstances. The power to punish under the paragraph 9 permits imprisonment for a period of not exceeding 6 months for specific reasons mentioned in that paragraph. Meanwhile, under paragraph 26, the sentencing authority varies according to the court's jurisdiction. The session courts have the power to impose a maximum fine of 300 ringgits or imprisonment for up to 6 weeks, while the first class magistrates can impose a maximum fine of 150 ringgits or imprisonment for up to 3 weeks, while a second class magistrate's jurisdiction is limited to a maximum fine of 50 ringgits or detention for up to 1 week. When we look into the rules of court 2012, the rules of court 2012 was made under the authority of the Courts of Judicature Act, and other statutes specifically provide procedures for proceedings. Order 52, which addresses the contempt of court, sets out the procedures for initiating, conducting, and concluding contempt proceedings. It specifies that the court must issue a notice to the alleged contemptor, providing an opportunity for them to defend themselves. Also, Order 52, Rule number 3 states that a person can be committed for contempt if he or she disobeys or disregards any order of the court or misconducts himself, herself in the presence of the court or any other manner which constitutes contempt. The rules also specify that the proceedings for contempt can be initiated through summons and require courts to ensure procedural fairness. When looking into the Civil Law Act 1956 in Malaysia, under Section 3 of the Civil Law Act 1956, the principles of English common laws are applicable. However, Malaysian courts will also consider local conditions and may take a stricter view when it comes to issues involving the dignity of the court. For example, in the AG Malaysia versus Manjit case, this was highlighted. Also, in another case, Jamil bin Harun case, Lord's Common stated that it is for Malaysian courts to decide within the limits of the law whether to apply the English case law or not. Now, looking into some case law definition of contempt, in the case of Manjit Singh, the Supreme Court quoted a simple definition from the case of R versus Gray. Russell of Kilowin said that the contempt includes any act or publication that is likely to bring a court or judge into disrespect or reduce their authority. It also includes acts or writings that interfere with the proper running of justice or the court's lawful processes. Also, in the case of Monatek, the federal court adopted a broad definition of contempt. They said that it covers any conduct that tends to be disrespect or interfere with the authority and functioning of law or prejudices the parties, witnesses, or the court during litigation. When we look into the natures of contempt, there are two types of contempt, that is the civil and criminal natures of contempt. However, distinguishing nature is not always very clear. In civil context, in simple terms, civil contempt is the failure to obey a court order that was issued for another party's benefit. This happens when someone fails to comply with the terms and conditions of a court or under a judgment. In some cases, when someone shows disrespect to the court or lies to the court, it is said to be contempt in the face of court. When we look into the criminal contempt in simple terms can be explained as an act that obstructs justice or attacks the integrity of the court. This is when someone tries to interfere with due administration of justice by the court. For example, advocates and solicitors or lawyers making public comments to influence court decisions. The difference between the two can be described as the difference between refusing to do what has been ordered, which is civil, and affirmatively doing what has been prohibited, which is criminal. The categories of court of the categories of contempt of court will be followed in the next slide. When looking into the categories of contempt of court, it has not been authoritatively defined by statutes of Malaysia so far. As such, it is left for the courts to clarify these categories. The traditional categories of contempt of court, like disobeying a court order, scandalizing the court, sub judice contempt in the face of court, and interfering with the work of court officers, has been recognized in several Malaysian cases by courts. These traditional categories are also recognized by cases in the United Kingdom collected by the authors in textbooks. This extends to disobedience of court orders, scandalizing the court, sub judice contempt in the face of court, and interference with persons officially connected with the court. While the courts may not be limited to these categories, there is some consistency in the recognition of these traditional categories. However, in this PPT, we will be only focusing on contempt of court in regard to disobeying or fulfilling a court order. In the MediaCorp case, it was given an explanation of what contempt of court in regard to disobeying or fulfilling a court order consists of. It was said that it was explained that this type of contempt of court involves proving that the proposed contempt parties had willfully or they had deliberately disobeyed or disregarded the court order. So when we discuss the most common and fundamental reasons for penalizing non-compliance in regards to failure to obey to a court order, why is it so important? First, firstly, obeying a court order is the backbone of the judicial process. When a court issues an order, whether to pay a sum of money, to seize a certain conduct, or to comply with certain terms, it signifies the authority of the court to make binding decisions. So, if a party ignores or refuses to obey these orders, it undermines the authority of the judiciary and weakens the rule of law. Also, the rationale for such powers to punish contempt is that if such power is absent, then the public will lose the confidence in the authority of the judicial arm of the state, leading to anarchy and disorder. Purpose is not to Purpose of this is not to vindicate the dignity of the individual judge or other judicial officer of the court or even the court itself, but it is to prevent an undue influence with the administration of justice in the public interest case. This was observed in the MBF holding case. For example, in Malaysian case, that is the Lila Ratos case, the court emphasized that punishing contempt for disobedience of court orders is necessary to uphold the authority of the judiciary. The case involved a situation where a party refused to comply with the court's injunction, and the court held that penalizing such disobedience was essential to maintain order and the court's dignity. Also, penalizing non-compliance acts as a clear message that court orders are not mere suggestions, they are commands that must be obeyed. This helps to preserve the judicial system's effectiveness and ensures that judgments are enforced. Without this enforcement, courts' decisions risk becoming a mere recommendation rather than binding rulings, which could lead to chaos and erosion of respect of the law. When we look into the arguments that supports the sustainability, the suitability and fairness of contempt of court, one key argument is that enforcing obedience to the court order upholds the fundamental principle of the rule of law. Courts must be obeyed to ensure justice is effectively delivered and that the authority of the judiciary is respected by all. Malaysian cases, such as the Leela Rathos case, emphasizes the contempt sanctions are necessary to reinforce the authority of the courts. This helps to ensure the court's decisions are binding and that everyone recognizes the importance of complying with the judicial rulings. Also, having clear sanctions acts as a strong reminder of the court's authority when penalties for contempt are well defined. It signals to the public and parties involved that the court orders are serious and must be obeyed. This in turn helps to reinforce the respect for the judiciary's powers as highlighted in the William Jacks case. Another important point is that the penalties should be proportionate to the misconduct. Malaysian law also recognizes that lighter sanctions are appropriate for minor breaches, while some severe penalties are justified for serious violation. This principle of proportionality ensures fairness in the legal processes and prevents individuals from being unfairly punished. Such fairness is supported by the consistent application of due processes in Malaysian case law, such as Lila Rato's case. Finally, the Malaysian courts have demonstrated a strong commitment to procedural fairness when dealing with contempt cases such as Lila Rathos and Lila Sangt. Kiang affirms that individuals must be given a fair opportunity to present their defense before sanctions are imposed. This emphasis on due processes guarantees the contempt proceedings are conducted justly, thereby supporting the fairness and legitimacy of the legal system. In conclusion, it's clear that contempt of court plays a vital role in maintaining the integrity and authority of the Malaysia's judiciary. In a democratic society where the rule of law is fundamental, ensuring that the court orders are obeyed is essential for social order and public confidence in the justice system. Although Malaysia does not have a single comprehensive law explicitly on contempt, the legal framework built through statutes like the Federal Constitution, the Courts Judicature Act, and numerous case law shows that the importance of penalizing non-compliance. These laws and decisions underscore the principle that enforcing adherence to court's order is necessary to uphold justice and to deter misconduct and also to preserve the dignity of the courts. One of the key reasons for imposing penalties is to reinforce the rule of law, reminding everyone that judicial decisions are binding. Such cases such as Leela Rathos have demonstrated that sanctions must be proportionate to the misconduct, ensuring fairness and preventing excessive punishments. Meanwhile, the courts also recognize the need to give parties a fair chance to explain their circumstances, balancing the authority with which individual rights through procedural fairness. However, challenges still do exist. There's a risk of disproportionate punishments, potential misuse of contempt of powers, and difficulties in distinguishing between deliberate disobedience and genuine inability or misunderstanding. So, to address these issues, Malaysia could consider clearer guidelines, legal reforms. These measures will promote fairness and consistency and transparency within the system. In conclusion, penalizing non-compliance with court orders remain both suitable and necessary in Malaysian law. When exercised with careful fairness, it helps to uphold the rule of law and strengthens the public trust in our judiciary, in the Malaysian judiciary. Moving forward, reforms aimed at clarity and safeguard will ensure this power is used judiciously, supporting the justice for all and maintaining the integrity of Malaysia's legal system.